All right, so we left off last time in the High Renaissance, which was the era of artists like Michelangelo and Raphael. So you'll remember that the sack of Rome in 1527 is marking a transition into this period of chaos and confusion that is oftentimes referred to in the art world as Mannerism. So it's at this point that the church is in disarray. There's also the Reformation that is happening, and a lot of the stuff that is happening at this point is laying the groundwork for the Counter Reformation, which is something that we'll see come into full force during the Baroque period in the next portion of the unit. Sometimes Mannerism gives a bad rap or is referred to as like a less quote unquote refined version of the Renaissance artwork. And even when you look at diagrams like this, there are a lot of negative connotations to Mannerism. So, for example, the content of the Renaissance is described as normal or idealized, whereas Mannerism as normal and strange. So it's oftentimes posed as the antithesis of Renaissance art and ideals. This is, however, not always necessarily true. Things are rarely black and white in the art world, no pun intended. This is just kind of like some generalizations that oftentimes art historians will use because art historians are dramatic people, and sometimes they just need to chill a little bit. Some Mannerist paintings are a mess, I will admit that, but others are actually quite beautiful. So these are a couple of other examples of Mannerist paintings to kind of give you an idea of what Mannerism is about. The AP curriculum doesn't necessarily give the best examples of Mannerism, in my opinion, in terms of like the pieces that are most like hyperbolically Mannerist. So I'm providing a couple of examples here to show you what they really mean when they're talking about like the more extreme side of the spectrum of Mannerism. For example, this piece over here, which is affectionately referred to as the Madonna of the Long Neck, you can see that her proportions are pretty elongated. You have this very strange composition where you have this figure's bare-legged, like shoved into the corner. There's a tiny man, and baby Jesus's body is very elongated. The composition is just kind of like confusing. This piece over here, Jesus is green. Like, and you also notice the colors here too are pretty bright and acidic, and your eye is swirling around the piece. It's not really finding a focal point. That's another kind of tenement of Mannerism, is that the figures are kind of in disarray. There's not a central focal point, and it's very difficult for the eye to come to rest at any given spot in the composition. You'll also notice that the figures are somewhat weightless and airy. Like this figure is on a ladder and he looks like he's just kind of floating. Same thing with Jesus, he looks like he's floating. In this piece, which is called Venus, Cupid, Folly, and Time, like you're seeing again this swirling composition. You have a lot of these points of tension along the edges of the piece. Like for example, like those of you who are artists know to not leave like important parts of the composition really close to the edge because it creates tension. But we see in this piece, like the foot is right in the corner. We have like vital part, like this image right here, this part of the figure's face is being cut off, like right at the ear. Like there's the composition is just intended to embody chaos. That, and like this is my favorite human figure ever. Like his back is so long and his neck is like many jointed. Like it's just like when you look at them at first glance, you're like, huh? And then you look at them even more and then you just get more confused. So this is our one of our Mannerist pieces in the curriculum. You'll notice that it's not like at first glance nearly as dramatic and hyperbolically strange as these three examples that I've given you here. However, when you give it more of a closer look, then you tend to pick up on the abnormalities. Again, we're getting this kind of like swirling circular composition. Your eye is traveling around and around and around and not really focusing on any one given focal point. A lot of art historians have pointed out that there's a lot of hands in the middle that are kind of gesturing towards the center, but even then you're still swirling around. This piece is also using high contrast, probably because it was placed inside of a chapel and it was intended to serve as an altarpiece. So using that high contrast between light and dark, that chiaroscuro, would have definitely made this piece stand out in a chapel, which is, unless it's in broad daylight, going to be rather dark. You're noticing also that the figures have this kind of disembodied ragdoll effect. They don't really have weight and substance to them. They're kind of floating. Like even this figure right here in the foreground, like he's bearing the weight of Jesus's dead body. Like this is heavy. So you'd expect that he would really be like collapsing under the weight, but he's standing on his tippy toes. So there's a very disembodied kind of like uncomfortable feeling to a lot of these paintings. Like this figure right here is also kind of on his toes, and he's also bearing the weight of Jesus right here. The figures are also crouched and twisted to fit into the composition. Perhaps the most obvious is this one where she's literally angling her head to follow the curve of the top of the painting. The three-dimensional space has also been flattened. What you'll notice is that these figures are kind of stacked on top of each other, kind of like if any of you have ever done choir practice and you have those bleachers that you stand on so that people in the back can be seen, that you're kind of almost getting that same effect here. Like unless these figures have really long legs, like they ought to be standing on something, and we're not really getting a sense as a viewer as to what they're standing on or how they're being supported. Another interesting thing about Mannerism is like the facial expressions oftentimes that you see in the artwork. The facial expressions are oftentimes just as embodied as the gestures of the figures themselves. Like there's kind of concern, but they're not like weeping. They're not outwardly like bawling. Like you're there's a degree of emotion, but it's almost masked in a way. There's also inconsistent shadows and an inconsistent light source. Like you don't know where the light is coming from in this piece. Is it coming from here? Maybe, but there's also light coming here. Like you would think that Jesus's body would be casting a shadow and making this area darker, but it's not. That's just how Mannerism is. There's not really any sense of orderliness to it, and this is kind of what is seen as antithetical to high Renaissance artwork, where everything in Renaissance artwork is orderly. You get these nice triangular compositions, you get linear perspective, everything is kind of like all the figures are kind of grouped into little clumps and everything kind of makes sense. It's logical, whereas Mannerism, everybody's kind of lost their mind. So interestingly, inside of this chapel, there is a piece from the High Renaissance right next to it. And this is an Annunciation scene. So we have the Archangel Gabriel here, who is announcing to Mary that she is pregnant with the Son of God. So again, when you look at this piece in comparison to the Entombment of Christ, you're seeing a sense of balance. You're also seeing trompe-l'oeil. These are painted on elements right here. And there's even elements of architecture here that look painted on. It's orderly, it's balanced, it's not too chaotic, and then right next to it is the Entombment of Christ. So it's very interesting that these two images were selected for the inside of this chapel, because this is basically the very beginning of Jesus' life, like even like before he's actually born. And this is shortly after he has died and is being removed from the cross and he's being prepared for burial. The next work is going to be a continuation of a piece that we had in the last lecture. So you'll recall that Michelangelo painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel from around 1508 to 1512. He was called back several decades later to paint the altar wall, which close up looks like this. So just when Michelangelo thought that he was done with the Sistine Chapel, that like he was free of this obligation that he really didn't want to do in the first place, he's again forced to paint even though he really doesn't want to, when he's old and cranky and has had enough. So he was almost in his 70s by the time that the altar wall was done. He was very old and very cranky and even pettier than he had been before. When you look at this image, I know there's a lot going on, so I try to break it down into a couple of different sections. So T is for top, M1 is for middle one, M2 is for middle, like second one, and then B is for bottom right here. So that's what these abbreviations mean. So there's 4 horizontal bands of figures. You can almost think of them like registers, but they're not super like linear. It's not as obvious as something that you would see in like Egyptian artwork. So on the very first like quote unquote register, you see 2 arrangements right here. One is a bunch of angels carrying the cross that Jesus was crucified on, and then the other is like a similar arrangement where you have a lot of these figures that are gripping a pillar, and this is the pillar that Christ was flogged on prior to his crucifixion. So these are kind of like instruments of the crucifixion right here. In the register just below that, we have Jesus in the middle. And then we also have people who are rising to heaven. This is a last judgment scene, so this is basically the second coming of Christ. So Jesus is basically saying all the people who were good are coming back to life. You can see them like becoming reanimated down here, and they rise to heaven, whereas the damned will be sent to hell, which is over here. Typically, the left side of the arrangement and last judgment pieces is people ascending to heaven, and then the right side is people descending to hell. So there was a lot of controversy around Jesus in particular as this piece was being made. A lot of church officials thought that it was particularly scandalous. They thought that Jesus looked more like an Apollo than a Jesus. They're like, he's beardless, how dare you? So there was a lot of kind of like controversy around that. That, and he was also super ripped and buff. And a lot of the church officials were like, this is more of like about beauty and like making things sexy rather than making them accurate. In the second register below that, you are again seeing some figures that are rising to heaven and then others that are falling to hell. In between these two sections too, there's also several saints that have been depicted, a lot of them with their saintly attributes. So we've talked about Saint Sebastian before, for example. He was the guy that was shot full of arrows. I'm not entirely sure where he is in this piece, but there's also Saint Bartholomew, I think his name is, and he's holding his own flayed skin. There's Saint Catherine. Like, there's a bunch of saints in here that are kind of surrounding Jesus. So this kind of like arrangement here is really kind of like beginning the full descent into Mannerism. Elongated bodies, chaotic groupings of figures, very kind of like strange contorted arrangements of those figures. There's a lot of foreshortening in this piece that Michelangelo is utilizing, and that was another thing that the church officials had problems with. They're like, it's confusing to the layman viewer, and we don't like it. And Michelangelo was like, I don't care. So this work was, again, heavily criticized at its time. Most of these figures used to be nude. After Michelangelo's death, a painter was actually hired to paint these like convenient little draperies in front of the figures, and they're more kind of like what the church would have referred to as scandalous areas. There were some clothes that were also painted on the female figures as well. St. Catherine used to be naked. There were also a lot of officials that were like, this is not what the Last Judgment looks like. Like, all of the people or all of the angels that are playing trumpets to announce the end of the world are in one group, and yet there's like several arrangements of angels here. They're like, there's no weather that exists during the Last Judgment, and yet some like elements of this piece are like blowing in the wind or seem to be affected by weather. Like, there's lots of different elements of this piece that seem to challenge like this more canonized establishment version of the Last Judgment as it is described in the Bible, and there was a lot of pressure on popes in this generation to have the altar removed completely or to at least have it changed. And they did cave eventually to some of those changes, including the change that involved painting clothes on some of the figures. So to give you one last kind of like view of this particular work, it was restored recently, which is why this looks pretty different from this. Upon its restoration, a lot of art historians were like, oh, it's a lot like brighter and softer than we thought it was. Like, we're seeing it in an entirely new light. So again, the saved are rising on the left, and then the damned are falling on the right. Here's the lower portions. We have the angels. This is one of my favorite details right here. This is the ferryman Charon, who is a figure in Greek mythology who basically ferries people to the underworld. And then here's the entrance to hell. There's the devil back there. Super fun. This is what I'm talking about when I refer to like foreshortening and like these very strange contorted arrangements of figures. There's a lot of angels here that are basically beating people down into hell. This is one of my favorite kind of like elements of Michelangelo's pettiness. It is continuing even later into his life because, of course, it does. So, as the altar fresco was being completed, one of the Pope's officials, the master of ceremonies, basically complained that it was disgraceful. It's all these nude figures are exposing themselves so shamefully. It's not work for a chapel, but rather for a public bath or a tavern. It's lascivious and disgusting. So Michelangelo apparently heard about this, and he painted this guy's face on Minos, who is judge of the underworld right here. And then he gave him donkey ears and then had a snake biting his genitals, because of course Michelangelo did. One of my favorite parts of the story is that Susanna was like complaining to the Pope, and one of them was like, well, you don't have any jurisdiction in hell, so we can't really do anything about it. So this is living on in posterity as perhaps one of the pettiest but most hilarious acts of all time. Thank you, Michelangelo. Our next artwork is the Facade of Il Jesú. So this artwork is more of like a transition piece between Mannerism and Baroque. Baroque is something that we'll be starting to cover next class. So to give you a little bit of context about this building, this is the mother church of the Jesuit order. So the Jesuits were a group of priests who did lots of missionary work, and they were strongly opposed to the Reformation, which you'll remember was this kind of like calling out of the Catholic Church for basically allowing rich people to pay their way into heaven. So these people like responded to the Reformation with this extremely zealous and opulent demonstration of faith by crafting these gigantic churches and laying the foundations for what would become the Baroque period. So you'll notice that there's several elements of classical architecture in this piece. We can see volutes, which again are these kind of like snail shell curls. We remember these from Ionic columns, but you can see that they've kind of been stretched out and used along the side of the building. There's some Corinthian column looking pilasters that are on the building. These are not weight bearing, but rather decorative. They're just there to make it look pretty. We of course have a pediment and several little kind of like niche structures that probably would have held sculptures at some point in time. And there's also like little tympana along the sides as well. So this building doesn't really have side aisles. They're rather, yeah, rather they don't really have transepts. They're kind of squished into the side aisles, so you can sort of see the cruciform nature of the church right here, but it's kind of squished. This building is marking a transition into Baroque architecture, where you're getting lots of swirls and curls and irregular shapes and forms. And this is something that is becoming particularly opulent and shiny and glitzy in Southern Europe, whereas in Northern Europe, the works tend to get smaller, darker, and less ornamental in nature. So this is the Triumph in the Name of Jesus fresco, which is on the ceiling of the nave of Il Gesù. So right here is where the Triumph of the Name of Jesus fresco is. This is a Baroque painting slash sculpture in a Mannerist building with a Mannerist slash Baroque facade. I know it's confusing, and I apologize. We're going to be going over this painting when we cover Baroque art next time.